Welcome to one of the world's great museums, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. The museum collection began with Queen Catherine the Great in 1764, and it's been open to the public for the last 170 years. For people outside Russia, it isn't easy to get here. But even if you can, the vast majority of the museum's 3 million artifacts are off limits and known mainly to scholars, and the Jewish treasures of the museum have never been widely known. We'd like to invite you to join us for a rare tour and for a glimpse of Jewish history and culture as they appear in the treasures of the Hermitage. In this museum, the label Jewish can't always be taken at face value. Take, for example, the artifact known as the key to the holy city of Jerusalem. It's actually a key and a lock that were given as a gift to Tsar Nicholas I. They'd been found in 1839 near the Tower of David in the old city of Jerusalem. They belonged to a gate that protected the city in the 12th century. Because they were from Jerusalem, they were labeled a Jewish relic, even though this was a time when the last Jewish kingdom had been defunct for more than 1,000 years. Jews were barely present in Jerusalem and certainly didn't control its gates. This supposedly Jewish artifact actually had nothing to do with Jews at all. If some of the Jewish objects at the Hermitage aren't really Jewish, some of the most striking insights into Judaism here can be found in art that's explicitly Christian. And that's the subject of this first visit to the museum. Aleph. Bet. These are the first letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They'd be familiar to readers of Hebrew today. But the alphabet didn't always look like this. And there's a painting in one room of the Hermitage that gives us a fascinating window into how Hebrew script evolved, even though the artist in question didn't know any Hebrew himself. This painting is called The Annunciation. It's by the Italian artist Giovanni Battista Cima, who painted it in 1495. There weren't many experts in Christian Europe who could read Hebrew at the time, but artists like Giovanni Battista Cima knew that Hebrew script was a symbol of antiquity. It was a detail that conveyed authenticity in a work of art. The living Jews of Europe were often hated and persecuted, and their texts were censored by the church and occasionally burned. But the Hebrew language was still thought of as the tongue in which God had created the world and had given names to the angels. Let's look closely at the inscription in one corner of this painting. If you know Hebrew, you'll recognize it as a quote from the book of Isaiah. In Hebrew it reads, Hinei ha'alma hara ve'oledet ben. Or in English, Behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son. Christians have always interpreted the word alma to mean virgin, and have seen the passage as a prophecy looking ahead to the birth of their own religion. That's exactly what's depicted in the painting. The angel on the left is announcing to the Virgin Mary that she'll become the mother of Jesus. For Christians, the prophecy of Isaiah is an important link between the Old and New Testaments, between Judaism and Christianity. People like Giovanni Battista Cima would have known the text in the church's official version, the one in Latin, but the artist decided to write this quote in Hebrew. In the art workshops of Renaissance Italy, someone who wanted to use Hebrew in a painting had 3 options. The first was to draw something vaguely resembling some ancient script. Because almost no one knew what real Hebrew looked like, you could use Egyptian hieroglyphs, Anglo-Saxon runes, and even random squiggles. The audience would never know the difference. The second option was to take real letters from the Hebrew alphabet, but place them in some arbitrary order. Again, almost no one would ever know. The third approach was the most honest, but also the most time-consuming. This was to actually write a Hebrew phrase correctly and integrate it as an element of the story you were trying to tell. That's exactly what we see in Giovanni Battista Cima's painting. The inscription here is correct. How did he get it right? There was contact between Jews and Christians at the time. We know that Jewish scribes would sometimes have Christian craftsmen add artwork like borders and illustrations to their Hebrew texts. So, did this also work in the other direction? Did Christian artists consult Jewish experts before using Hebrew in their work? Judging by the script in the painting, the Hebrew text wasn't painted by a professional Hebrew scribe. It seems to have been done by either the artist himself or by an apprentice. But in spelling and grammar, the inscription is completely accurate. So where did they copy it from? The most obvious explanation is that the artist turned to the Jewish community and someone wrote the text out for him to use as a reference. But the shape of the letters in the painting suggests this isn't what happened. This font isn't at all like the cursive script that the Jewish community of Italy was using at the time. Handwritten books and Torah scrolls were written in a font that doesn't look like the one in this painting. The most likely explanation is that the artist copied the inscription not from a handwritten text, but from an innovation that was brand new at the time: a printed book. Printing began in Italy in the 1460s, which happened to be around the time that Giovanni Battista Cima was born. In those days, the Jews around Giovanni's world were divided into three main communities. The first was the local community in Rome and the lands that we would now call Italy. The second was made up of Sephardic Jews who'd been expelled from Catholic Spain. The third group consisted of the Ashkenazim, who lived mostly in German-speaking lands. These different groups of Jews all used different kinds of script. The first printers of Hebrew books, quite understandably, used the font that would be familiar to the majority of their customers. In the 1470s, they were still copying the local Italian style, which was semi-cursive. But after that, the printers developed a special font based on the Sephardic script. Apparently, it was the Sephardic Jews who were the most enthusiastic buyers of Hebrew Bibles. By the time Giovanni Battista Cima had finished our painting, The Annunciation, there were 3 printed Hebrew Bibles already available in Italy. All of them were printed in a similar script, one based on the Sephardic letters, but with elements taken from the more square-shaped letters of Ashkenazi writing. It's precisely this font that the artist copied. He didn't need to ask actual Jews for advice. He could just get hold of one of the new printed Bibles and look for the right passage. In a different room at the Hermitage, we find another example of Hebrew script in a work of Christian art. But this time the script seems to have been copied not from a printed book, but from a manuscript, perhaps from a Torah scroll. But that's not the only way this painting differs. This one is called The Allegory of the Old and New Testaments. The Italian artist Benvenuto Tisi worked on it for 3 years, from 1528 to 1531. Unlike the previous painting we were looking at, which was painted 30 years earlier and showed no particular animosity toward Judaism, this work reflects a more hostile position. A crucifix divides the canvas into 4 parts. The lighter side on the left is dedicated to the New Testament and Christianity. Here we see a beautiful figure representing the church wearing the tiara of the Pope. And that image is set against an image on the right representing the synagogue or Judaism as an old woman who's lost her crown with a broken scepter in her hand. In the lower half of the painting, the Christian sacraments, baptism, confession, and communion, are contrasted with the supposedly primitive Old Testament practice of animal sacrifice, which is captioned with a single Hebrew word, chatat. The word literally means sin, and in this context, it means a sacrifice of atonement for sin, as practiced by ancient Jews. According to the traditions described in Jewish texts, One of the goats in this scene will be sacrificed to God, while the other will become the scapegoat. The sins of humans will symbolically be transferred onto the animal by the temple priests, who will then cast it out into the desert. The Hebrew word that Benvenuto Tisi has added here, chatat, makes clear the Jewish nature of the ritual he's describing, which was wrong-headed and sinful in Christian eyes. But whatever his attitude to Jews and Judaism, the artist took care to write the word perfectly, using the square script that was still common in handwritten texts used by Ashkenazi Jews at the time, and which would soon be rendered mostly obsolete by the rise of the printing press. These tiny details from paintings at the Hermitage allow us a glimpse of the Jewish communities that were living and changing on the margins of the world familiar to these artists. They also give us a look at the complex and conflicted relationship between Christianity and Judaism, a story that's at the very root of the culture of Europe.